First thing we'd like to talk about, to get to the core of the teachings of St. John Paul II on human love and the divine plan. A lot of times people use the term, quote unquote, theology of the body. He uses the term a few times, but it's not to be reduced to that. There's a big danger in reducing the whole catechesis to being merely a theology of the body. If we're referring to it in passing in that way because everybody knows it that way by now, okay. But it's very important not to teach it as simply a theology of the body. This is not to disparage the body or reduce its importance, but it's to say that there's something more. We can't stop there. Redemption of the body is very important. Jesus is incarnate. He comes in the flesh in order to sanctify the flesh. So the flesh itself is good as a creative element. Of course, when sin corrupts it, things happen, and that's not so good. But God creates it to be good. But he creates the human person, body and soul. Okay? So the theology of the body is really a theology of the human person. We're not supposed to stop at only the body. We're talking as much about the soul integrated with the body integrated with the soul. So if you will, an incarnated spirit or an inspired body. That would be correct. Theology of the inspired body or theology of the incarnated spirit, those would be much more accurate than mere theology of the body. So let's go to the core teaching of the catechesis, which really is the core teaching also of his work that precedes it, Love and Responsibility. Love and Responsibility is probably the most important work in sexual ethics in the 20th century by Karol Wojtyła, who then will become St. John Paul II eventually. Okay, so when he is priest and bishop and archbishop, cardinal in Krakow, Poland, he has been teaching young couples, accompanying them on forest excursions in the Polish mountains, doing retreats with them under threat of punishment by the government, teaching things that they didn't want him to teach, has a bigger and bigger following. And as one of my professors at the John Paul II Institute in Rome, I had one of the men who was in this group, which in Polish is called środowisko, okay? In this milieu, this gathering, where they would come together as a communion of persons to share with each other about the meaning of human sexuality in God's plan. So, let's start with this whole concept of the communion of persons. This is the core concept in John Paul's teaching. If we're missing that, we're missing everything. Okay? The communion of persons, what is that? That is one person, body and soul, encountering another person, body and soul. Notice I say encountering. Yeah? Face-to-face encounter. Okay? And through the gift of one to the other and receiving of the other's gift and giving in return in reciprocity, the communion of persons is built. Now, this is very much how God operates in his life. The divine communion of persons is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, of course. Okay? So Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who are constantly pouring themselves out, one for the other, one to the other, constantly receiving from the other. They're giving of themselves as a gift. They don't seek to glorify themselves, but they always seek to give glory to the other persons of the Godhead. So when we get to Genesis, and we see that God has created man in his image and likeness, male and female, he created them, then we see that there's supposed to be a human communion of persons that more truly reflects God's own being. Man in and of himself isn't the full picture. But male and female together as a communion of persons reflects, by analogy, God's divine communion of persons. And that the Father and the Son love each other so much, and their love interpenetrates one into the other, and that the heart of God the Father is completely in God the Son, and God the Son's heart is completely within God the Father. They have a mutual indwelling, okay, what the Greek will call perikinesis, or the Latins will call circumcision, circumcisatio. Their love is so profound and so perfect and so complete that the third person of the Trinity is generated. The Holy Spirit, who, not it, but who is the love of God the Father and God the Son. So, by analogy, the human being, the human person, body and soul, in communion together, the two becoming as one, in holy matrimony, one making a perfect gift of himself to the bride making a perfect gift of herself to the groom, that their love has this great potential to generate new life in the fruit, the children. Okay? So by analogy, the Christian family refers to God the Father as a family of persons, a family of divine persons. Okay? Now, the communion of persons that's divine is holy. And the holiness is a perfect holiness in love. A holiness in perfect love. A complete love. It's missing nothing. It's lacking nothing. There's no disorder. Okay? And so God's design for the human communion of persons, in this case, incarnated, body and soul, that in their bodiliness and in their spiritual life, together integrated as their personal life, if you will, they are to be perfect as God himself is perfect. So no corruption at any level. If you have corruption at the bodily level, it will have an impact on the spiritual. If you have corruption at the spiritual level, it will have impact on the bodily. Okay. So we know immediately that it can't just be a theology of the body and leave it there. There's much more. We're talking about a communion of persons who are called to holiness, which means to reflect in their persons the image of God, that they have dignity, being in the having a face that reflects God's goodness and reflects God's own person. But image and likeness, the likeness involves acting as God, making a choice in every action of the will informed by the intellect to love as God loves. And so together, the image and the likeness, as they are consistently persevering in living in God's perfection, will be holy as they do that. Okay? Obviously, things come into the picture and corrupt, concupiscence, sin, temptation, everything else. But just to mention very briefly, and then Dr. Dawn will share something, that this is a fundamental concept when we are catechizing couples for marriage, or we're catechizing couples who are already married. There is a social understanding in many cultures around the world. You can speak much more about the Indian context than we can. But that marriage is all about being happy. That everything in life is about being happy. It's kind of a happy, happy, joy, joy. And everybody throws flowers at each other, and we eat ice cream, which is a good thing, all right? And we eat a lot of chocolate, and that's a good thing too. Hint, hint, I hope lunch is coming with chocolate and ice cream. That would be a perfect lunch for me. I'll let you eat the potatoes. Give me your chocolate. That in the middle of that, we are living goodness. In living goodness, we will reach the deeper calling to holiness. But in the emotionalistic perspective of the world, happiness can get corrupted very quickly. Everything becomes relativistic all of a sudden. Well, my happiness means this, my happiness means that. And if people are pursuing happiness in and of itself as the final goal, it becomes all about me all of a sudden. It becomes very much self-referential. And you can't build communion on a bunch of self-referential people. Egocentrism does not build communion. So there's something more to this happiness than what the secular mentality has in mind. If we encourage couples to pursue holiness, then it also admits that there will be a possibility of suffering, but that's going to happen anyways. And instead of having people's dreams for happiness shattered, and they live desperate lives where they think their lives are over because they're experiencing suffering that they weren't anticipating, or they feel that because they're suffering, they're failing in meeting their goal of happiness in life. Instead, when they see suffering, they realize maybe this is a part of realizing happiness down the road. And that I have to make an act of sacrifice, and that this involves patience, and the sacrifice and the patience that are very much intrinsic, a core part of living a life of holiness. Then, in due course, as perseverance continues to bear its fruit, real happiness, authentic happiness, genuine happiness with the communion of persons will be realized.
To build upon and amplify some of the things that Father Gregory was saying, you said something about the face. Do you remember what that was with respect to theology of the communion of persons?
Yes, that the image of God, God has, by his creative act, written his divine face by reflection in the individual faces of the people, whether they're, again, like red and yellow, black and white. Doesn't matter what race, God's image is written into the human person.
In the book of interviews that came out at the beginning of John Paul II's pontificate, Crossing the Threshold of Hope, John Paul spoke about his admiration for the Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, and he spoke especially about how he appreciated Levinas's theology of the face. And at the heart of Levinas's theology of the face is this understanding that the face represents the person. One of the major themes that would come out in John Paul's Catechesis on Human Love, which is the series of Wednesday audiences that, as I believe Father Gregory said, are more popularly but somewhat inaccurately known as the theology of the body. One of the messages of the first part of those audiences is that the human person, in developing an awareness of himself, recognizes that he or she is different from animals. And John Paul traces this to the experience of original man, the first man, the first woman. Now, it's my understanding, a friend of mine told me this, and I can't remember the exact details, but that the French language has two words for face, and one of those words refers to just generally, and it could be the face of an animal, whereas the other refers specifically to the human face. So one's visage. Do you remember what the other one is? Anyone know? Is it tête or is that head? That's head. So it's interesting in that, as my friend explained to me, if you're French and you're angry at someone, you might say to them, "I don't like your face," and the word that you use is for the animal's face and not the human face. So part of the message of the Catechesis on Human Love, and the reason why, as Father Gregory says, it's much more a theology of the person, than merely a theology of the body. The person includes body and soul. Is that John Paul holds that the face represents the person, and this has implications for. Oh, thank you. This is so it's figure and visage. I think figure is the animal one, whereas visage is only the face. Those are the French terms. Anyway, so John Paul, in his theology of the or rather Catechesis on the Human Love, emphasizes that the face represents the person. The human person, unlike the animals, has a face, and so can enter into a communion of persons face to face in friendship, face to face in human spousal love, and face to face in what John Paul also calls spousal love with respect to that the human person can enter into communion with God. The human person as a member of the church, that is the bride of Christ, can enter into communion with God face to face, which is a communion that's realized in heaven. There are many passages relating to this in the Catechesis on Human Love. I just found one here in one of the Wednesday audiences. John Paul is speaking about the future resurrection of the body, and he says, in this spiritualization and divinization in which man will participate in the resurrection, we discover in an eschatological perspective. Eschatological, that means the Pope's speaking about the last things. He's speaking about the life of heaven. He says, we discover in an eschatological perspective the same characteristics that mark the spousal meaning of the body. We discover them in the encounter with the mystery of the living God, which reveals itself through the face-to-face vision of him. So even when John Paul is speaking of the spousal meaning of the body, and he uses the word body, he's always thinking that our human loves are meant to point to this divine love, this divine communion, and we know that although God in his divinity, I'm not speaking of Jesus' humanity here, but God in his divine nature does not have a body, we know that in a deeper way than we can imagine, God has a face. And this is the message, this is the goal of our own communion of persons, of all our human relationships that are relationships of love and relationships that are chaste according to the nature of the relationship. The goal of our human relationships of chastity, of love, is to enter into this face-to-face communion with God.
Thank you very much. So you can see from what Dr. Dawn is saying that it would be an error to merely look at John Paul II's Catechesis on Human Love as being merely a theology of sex. Many times it's promoted that way. You're going to find much, much more on sexual morality in John Paul II's book, Love and Responsibility, in terms of the details and the dynamics, the various threats to understanding God's design for human sexuality. It's not to say that there aren't elements in the catecheses that are very relevant. Of course there are. But to take it and say, well, it's a theology of sex and kind of leave it there would be doing a pretty grave injustice. And so it's a very incomplete picture. And what our hope to do today, and through our various discussions throughout the day especially, but also tomorrow, as we start looking at these teachings in light of having to confront a lot of the crises that we're facing in culture, that's a lot more tomorrow's discussion, that there'll be a deeper understanding of kind of the complete teaching. of how love and responsibility dovetail and build one into the other. Because the catecheses on human love, those were being written by John Paul II. He was even scribbling things during the conclave that elected him. He was known to double task and triple task at one time, even before the internet could help him do it, And love and responsibility was the fundamental work, and then the catecheses on human love were built really as an appendix to that. So you can't understand one without the other in its fullness. There's an aspect of the catecheses that is contributing what love and responsibility had not yet developed more fully. And certainly at a magisterial level, you have the catecheses released when he's Pope. But then love and responsibility is providing all of that foundational framework without which you can't have a complete understanding of the catecheses. So, we've talked about divine communion and human communion. When we're talking about encounter, we're talking about God as mystery with a capital M. And God is not a mystery to himself, but he's a perfect mystery to us. We only understand God to the extent he has revealed himself to us. And so divine revelation is his own personal unfolding of himself in the areas where he believes out of his love it is important for us to understand him in order to be perfect reflections of his love. So he reveals what's necessary. He doesn't give us everything. Yes, he gives us his own very self. He gives himself completely to us. But that doesn't mean we have a full intelligibility of every aspect of himself. We don't know how he created the universe. We know that he did. But we don't have all the formulae. We don't have all of the understanding and the depths of comprehension that he has. We can't begin to. If we did, he would no longer be a mystery. He would be a problem solved. He would have been calculated. And there's some scientists who feel they have calculated God. But ultimately, they're very frustrated scientists. But I would say they're very frustrating scientists as well, because there tends to be an arrogance that posits they know the secrets of the universe when really they don't. And as many of you are in positions of leadership, we have doctors, we have scientists in here, we've got ministry leaders in here, and I think we could probably all agree we don't have the answers to everything. We just don't. If you have the answers to everything, please let me know, because I'd like to put my little chip in you, and I'd like to download the solutions to cancer, AIDS, and everything else, and I'd make a lot of money off of you really fast. Okay. Now, if we are created in his image and likeness, that means we must be mysteries too, but not mysteries to God. He has created us. He knows every fiber of our being. He knows every hair, every cell, every chromosome. He doesn't have confusion about whether we're male or female. A lot of people in our culture seem to be confused about XX and XY these days. He gave us 2 letters. They were pretty easy, like kind of a binary code for genetics, and we still get confused. And we have to go to Facebook for 54 different variations to XXXY. But I can't do more than XX and XY myself, okay? Count on human beings to complicate the picture, all right? That in itself is part of the mystery of sin. But mystery in the human person, this is something that Gabriel Marcel, a French existential philosopher of the 40s, 1950s, 1960s, had a very deep influence on the young philosopher Karl Wojtyła. It plays a very central role in his phenomenological approach to the human person. Phenomenology being that school of philosophy that sees something or sees someone, and that you have various schema that are looking at different perspectives at that same thing, but still arriving existentially, this is the thing itself. So I know I'm Father Gregory, you know I'm Father Gregory, but my view of Father Gregory right now is very different than your view of Father Gregory, and every one of you has a little bit of a different perspective of Father Gregory, even in how you're looking at me. Probably emotionally and mentally, you have a different figure of Father Gregory already, too. By the end of tomorrow, it will be even more diverse. But it doesn't stop me from being Father Gregory. Okay? How can I look at this phone? I look at this, you say telephone, right? Cell phone. I look at it and see cell phone, but you have a different visual than I have. But we both come to the same idea. This is a telephone. Okay? Ask George Washington or Mahatma Gandhi what this is. Gandhi wouldn't give you that answer. He wouldn't know what this is. George Washington would certainly not know what it is. In fact, he would probably faint because like seeing all this technology and know, if I just do this, he would probably think it's the devil and pass out, you know? And so these perspectives also can be applied to the human person. And that's what Marcel does, that we are a mystery, even to ourselves. I don't understand myself completely, even if I may understand myself better than anybody else does, except maybe my mother. My mother is always in competition, right? Mothers are always in that position, yeah? But I think I'm still a mystery to my mother, all right? But to God, we're not mysteries. Why is this important? First of all, our first relationship is with God who knows us perfectly. So he is our first point of reference. If he knows us perfectly and we know he loves us perfectly, then we can have absolute security in him and we can rely on him for the answers about love. It also means that when we come to find relationship with each other, we don't understand the other perfectly. We don't understand ourselves perfectly. In the interaction between the two, we certainly don't understand perfectly. So there's always going to be the mystery of the encounter of the persons, as much as there is the mystery of one person in his or herself, the other person, him or herself. How they see the other may be a mystery to the other. And how the person sees him or herself may be a mystery to the other. So all of this is at play, and God provides clarity through a pursuit to be in perfect communion and seeking to reveal myself to the other, and the other reveals him or herself to me. The communion of persons is built through this gift of self that is offered, revealing to the other something which is given from the divine. Okay?
If I might say a couple of words about mystery, just speaking from the common parlance, and not speaking, necessarily in the scientific sense of theology. I like to think of a mystery as something that I will never get to the bottom of. For me, that helps me to understand it. I think that helps to distinguish it from the understanding of an Agatha Christie novel. It's not a whodunit. The whodunit, the Agatha Christie novel, is more like a problem to be solved, whereas a mystery is something that one can gaze into endlessly and never resolve it. This is why we also speak of the mystery of evil, as well as good mysteries, such as the mystery of creation, the mysteries of the Rosary, but the difference is that when we speak about the mystery of evil, we're speaking of a mystery that we can't get to the bottom of it because there is no bottom. Evil is a black hole. Mm-hmm. Whereas if we seek to gaze into the mystery of the Holy Trinity and the mysteries of love, divine love that flow from that, then the reason why we can never get into the bottom of it is because it's not because there is no bottom or there is no there, but it's because, as the psalmist says, when I thought about these things, they were too wonderful for me. We can't get to the bottom of the mystery of the Trinity because it is so far above us and will always be above us. Now, the worldly person, the worldly mindset, and this is the mindset that we see going on in the secular world, and we'll talk about this more with respect to pornography and how pornography fails to respect the mystery of the person. The worldly mindset wants to rip off the veils that cover our bodies, and in a psychological way, the worldly mindset wants to rip off psychological veils so that we each can psych out the other perfectly, and we can each, actually encompass the mystery of one another in a way that that presumes ownership. We can think of the worldly manner in that respect when we think of the practices of spiritual mediums who try to get the names of demons so that they can command those demons, because that's the worldly idea of seizing upon the mystery behind something in order to have possession and power. But in contrast, in heaven, we will be open to one another in a way that we can't be in this life. And although we can experience a taste of it in this life, in true friendship and in a special way in the spousal love between husband and wife, in the openness that's present in true friendship, in the love of husband and wife, and in that openness that's pointed, that these relationships point to in heaven, it's not a tearing of the veil, but it's rather a transparency that one has to another person through being transparent to God. The more that I am transparent to God, then in love and in friendship with God, then through that transparency to God, I become transparent to God's love in a way that God's love can shine through me, and then you can see me in a deeper way than you might if I had the different kinds of veils that I might otherwise put up between myself and God's love. So, in a certain sense, not in the sense that is sometimes described by speakers such as Christopher West, but in a certain sense, spousal love is about removing veils, but it's about removing veils or impediments between oneself and God, so that those impediments of sin and selfishness are no longer present when one is interacting with one's spouse, so that one can be open in a godly way. But even in heaven, when we no longer have these veils that prevent us from experiencing the love of God fully in this earthly life, even in heaven, when we have that openness in heaven, there will still be mystery. And this is something that I believe Eastern Christian theology speaks about quite a bit when speaking about eschatology, about the beatific vision, because as I said earlier, with the divine mysteries, we will never get to the bottom of them because they will always be higher than us. So even when we are completely open to God and to one another in heaven, we will still be constantly dazzled by the depth and breadth and height, of the love of God, and we will remain constantly dazzled by that love of God as reflected in the love of one another, the love of the saints in heaven.
Thank you. And this goes to what Gabriel Marcel said as a key concept, availability. Just as Mary is available, may it be done to me according to your will, may it be done to me according to the Father's will, that a soul that is pure and transparent, as Dr. Dawn is saying, is available to God's will, is available to be present to love for the purposes of loving, is not hardened against the possibility of communion. If you have two people who are hardened against each other, they're not available to each other. They've closed the doors. They're not willing to be vulnerable. Vulnerable, meaning from vulnerus in Latin, the ability to be wounded. Vulnera is a sword. Right? So to be sworded, S-W-O-R-D-E-D, is to be vulnerable, to be willing to have that possibility come about. Now, when Dr. Dawn is talking about pure transparency, it should not be a surprise to us that Thomas Aquinas himself, and Dr. Dawn is educated by the best Thomas out there, that chastity can be defined as pure, transparent love. So if we're talking about an education to chastity, we are educating the human person to be pure and transparent in love. And that is something that can never be violated. And if people are holding to a chaste approach, then what they are doing is they have a certain reverence for God and a reverence for each other, which means that anything related to human sexuality will always respect modesty. It will never be irreverent. It will always seek to be pure in heart, and it will not seek to unveil what should remain veiled. And this is one of the key aspects where we see West and his colleagues go into problematic perspectives, where he will say things like, if I am pure of heart, I should be able to look at a naked body and not lust. Last time I checked, God didn't say anything about our needing to look at naked bodies. Do you remember anything in Scripture that talks about the call to look at naked bodies? There's nothing like that. It's just not there. And that there's even the potential for one spouse to lust after the other. It's something so sacred that can be so easily distorted by concupiscence, that tendency to sin, if unveiled in an improper way, that spouses can lust after each other and violate conjugal chastity. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But outside of that context, we should not be looking at any naked bodies at all, except our own, or if we're medical doctors, only those areas that we have to examine modestly. And we know what happens with lawsuits and criminal cases when you have that certain perverted doctor who looks at things in a way he shouldn't, or the way that she shouldn't. And this is the point. This is the next point that Dr. Dawn is already seeing my heart here. That what John Paul II teaches, this brings us to the understanding in the catechesis that the body reveals the person. This is a crucial concept. The body is not a mere body. Okay? And one of the big errors that Christopher West put out, I reviewed a book in this, and I'll give this to you in a bibliography later, where he talks at the heart of the gospel. He takes heart and immediately says, well, what Bible means, it means body. And when you do that, it means no sense. It makes no sense, because the heart of the human person is much bigger than that. Anyone who's a doctor in here knows that we're not just talking about a physical organ when we talk about the heart. Otherwise, what does conversion of the heart mean? Does that mean changing it into a liver? Does that mean making a 3D image of, what's that mean? What does that mean if it's merely body? So obviously that's not true. Now, a few other points. These are to plant some foundations. The role of elementary experience. Karol Wojtyła speaks very much about the role of experience at the fundamental level. What are our first experiences? This helps us to understand the theology of God's love as he's written into the human person. A mother and child. What's the first encounter of a baby? It's usually with the mother. And then the mother introduces father. He's not He's not unsafe. He's your daddy. She makes an introduction to him. But he's already one step removed because daddy has not been intimately connected by blood vessels and cords and everything else and has not been physically feeding this little critter for 9 months. Mother has had the life sucked out of her, so she feels. What is this thing inside of me that's eating all my food, taking my blood away from me, making me nauseous at ridiculous times of the day, making me want to eat something really salty while having 5 liters of ice cream at the same time at 4 in the morning at the great convenience of the husband. These experiences are very intimate between a mother and a child. The father never has that level. But he has other experiences, and the child has other experiences. The first learning of authority, of what's right and what's wrong. Yes, you may work together with your mother in this way, but not in that way. And he starts laying down rules to guard the behavior and to provide discipline. You have experiences of brothers and sisters. You can have somebody who's a best friend like a brother and sister, but will never be that genetic brother or sister. Okay? Friendship, elementary experiences of friendship. Elementary experiences of grief. If somebody dies, it's in the family that people first learn to cope. Of joy. Joy that comes from, this is a wedding. And you go to a wedding and you do your first dance as a 3-year-old, or you're a flower boy or a flower girl. So these elementary experiences are very, very important for forming the human person. And if they're educated to love, then they will be very formative for the rest of the life in helping a person to live a chaste life, a holy life. So many people will say, many child psychiatrists, psychologists will say the first 6 years of a child's life absolutely crucial because so many of these formative experiences are taking hold and contributing to the persona of the person, who that person really is. Now, we could talk more about that, but just to keep the movement going here, that the personalistic norm is something that's a fundamental concept of Wojtyła's Love and Responsibility, this book that precedes the Catecheses. And the personalistic norm says that the human being is body and soul together, much like the ancient philosophers will say, that the body is inspired or the soul is incarnated, enfleshed, and it's an integrated whole. And that created in the image and likeness of God, the person is to be loved, not used. I will love this person means I will not use this person. This person is a subject like me, with his or her own dignity, and I am to encounter this person who is a son or a daughter of the Most High God, who is in his image and likeness. Masculine or feminine, manifesting the beauty of the human person who together in communion with other persons will show the face of God in its fullness. But the personalistic norm is saying I will not use the person because love does not ever permit the possibility of using another human being manipulatively for personal gain, objectifying the person as an object of sexual desire for my sexual gratification. This is not part of love. It's not to say I won't experience gratification in a perfect gift of myself for the other and receiving the gift of the other in me in a conjugal marital context that is pure and transparent, that is unitive, that is open to procreation, and that respects the indissoluble sacramental bond. In that case, the sexual act is conjugal. It's not merely animals in the front yard. It's not 2 elephants in the jungle. It's not 2 hyenas or lions or tigers re-looks, re-examines, and sees someone deeper. Hey, this isn't just a body. This is a human person whom I must respect. There's a reverence I must show. And that's part of expressing piety for God by respecting the human person. Objectification reduces the person to be an object, makes the person a thing to be used, to be utilized for some personal gain. So when we look at the great commandment, what is love? Matthew 22. Let's refresh our minds. The greatest commandment. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they came together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment, and the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law, Torah, and the prophets, Nevi'im. Okay? And notice that we see here, Jesus says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. It doesn't say with all your body. He says all your heart. So God is using the word heart for a very important reason. Cardia. We'll talk about that in the upcoming sessions. He's not talking body. He's not talking sarx. The word sarx is not used there. So when we look at what is the meaning in this communion, how does this communion come about? We look at Gaudium et Spes 22, and we look at Gaudium Spes 24. I'll leave 22 for your own examination for the sake of time, for the time being. I just want to show you the end of 24 from the Second Vatican Council. Indeed, the Lord Jesus, when he prayed to the Father that all may be one as we are one, perfect communion, right? Opened up vistas closed to human reason. Mere human thinking cannot reach this point. There's a divine inspiration involved. For he implied a certain likeness between the union of the divine persons and the unity of God's sons in truth and charity. This likeness reveals that man, who is the only creature on earth which God willed for itself, cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. Gaudium et Spes 24, but take note of Gaudium et Spes 22, and at the end of the conference you'll receive these different bullet points I'm giving you too.
Can I make just a brief point with respect to those words, truth and charity. There are people who would like to interpret the Second Vatican Council as though it were something that was a radical departure from everything that came before. But in fact, Pope John the 23rd, when convening the council, said that he wanted the council, he expected that the council would restate or reformulate the perennial teachings of the Church in language that could make these teachings come alive to the modern world. And this passage that Father Gregory just read is an excellent example of that. The classic teaching of the image of God in man, which in Latin is imago Dei, is that the human person is the image of, or we can make it a verb, the human person images God through his or her intellect and will. God knows, so the intellect is, the act of the intellect is knowing, and the act of the will is loving. So God knows, God loves, and God putting his image in the human person enabled us to know and to love, and to be able to know and love in ways that animals cannot. We do this in a higher way. So when we think in terms of what does God know, what does God love, well, certainly, at least since Augustine helped to formulate this understanding of Imago Dei, and certainly with St. Thomas Aquinas restating what Augustine said, we know that God knows and loves God. He knows and loves himself, and he knows and loves all his creation through knowing and loving himself. As the play by Thornton Wilder called Our Town puts it, we all have our existence within the mind of God. It is the mind, and we could also say heart of God, that sustains us. So the Second Vatican Council, in speaking about the union of the divine persons, that Jesus is implying a certain likeness between the union of divine persons and the union of God's sons in truth and charity. The Second Vatican Council uses those words, truth and charity, deliberately to show that they're taking the classic Augustinian and Thomistic teaching, and they're not making up a new doctrine, but they are developing the former doctrine to show implications of it, to bring out, to shed light on aspects of this earlier doctrine that were not so clear before. So the union in truth and charity, the union of the divine persons and the union of human persons in truth and charity, is a union in knowing and loving. So this is more than can be said in a couple of minutes, but it's certainly a beautiful Trinitarian mystery to think about, that the Second Vatican Council is bringing out that the human person has this and is in the image, has this image of God and is in the image of God in the powers of knowing and loving, for the precise purpose that this image of God in the human person may become active through communion with God and communion through God with one another.
Thank you. And just to wrap up this session, when we're talking about self-gift, this is when we start seeing the notion of sacrifice. If you think of the word sacrifice, S-A-C-R, sacro, holy, right? Fice is a form of the verb in Latin to make, to do. So an action that is sacrificial is an action that brings about holiness. Okay? So sacrifice is always an aspect of true love. We cannot separate true love from sacrifice. Because when we make a gift of ourselves, that means we're willing to lay our lives down. It's a self-death. It's a death of the ego for the sake of something greater. So what Gabriel Marcel says is that when the two are entering a conjugal life together, it is no more about me and I and I and I. It's we. And how beautiful it is that we are we. It is about us. And as long as there is us, there is hope. But if I'm reduced into the prison of my own ego, it becomes a place of hopelessness. It becomes a place of desperation. I'm alone. I have no other reference outside of myself to even help me understand who I am. We go back to those elementary experiences, and how do we know who we are? It's not by being, born out of an egg. We weren't hatched like a chicken. Even a chicken's kind of got a mother that way. But really, it's in being the son or a daughter of someone else. All right? We're born in relationship. From the very beginning, we're in relationship. We're in communion with my mother, with my father, hopefully too. But I have come out of a mother. And we already start to see the violations that happen at a bioethical level if biotechnology is not allowing for the generation of life out of a human being in a natural way, but is created in a laboratory, produced like something on an assembly line, is already being reduced in dignity. Is another reason why the church is against these technologies. Humanae Vitae is going to emphasize that the spouses, the meaning of human sexuality always must manifest the unitive building of communion, okay, with nothing restraining that. It must be open to procreation. It does not say that the couples have to intend to have a child every time they engage in the conjugal act, but they have to be open to God's perfect plan, that He knows best, and that they cannot put artificial walls up that become third persons in their relationship. It already is kind of a form of adultery, a violation of the sixth commandment when you bring contraception into the picture. So Humanae Vitae is condemning contraception for this reason, among others, because also it reduces the dignity of the design of God for human sexuality to be a complete encounter that has no walls, has no barriers. You're not giving a gift if you hold something back, if there's fear that gets involved. If I'm not giving myself fully, I'm not really giving myself. So spouses who are holding back from each other are not really engaged in the exchange of gift. And then the two are able to become as one in the flesh in that way, as we see in Genesis 1:26, where He creates the male and female in His image and likeness, 2:24, where the two are to become as one. And then St. Augustine takes those two aspects of unity and proles, the generation of offspring, of children, and adds sacramentum, which is indissolubility. He says that as they make their mutual consent to each other, and God receives their consent into His own bond of Christ with the church, that they are indissoluble. That bond is something that God has blessed that man cannot disrupt. And so that there's a real sacrament that happens. And Augustine has taught us this, and this is something the church has really held to very, very firmly for her history. And that this is why divorce is not permitted, because that ruptures communion, that breaks the possibility of generating new life, that violates the sacramental nature of God's design for them to be one for as long as they both shall live. Okay? Are we still together? You still awake? Do we need to stretch for a minute?